Hello students, this is Professor McDermott, and in today's lecture we're going to talk about what historians call the Atlantic world. Now, you know already that when Europeans began to explore and colonize the New World, it led to a great deal of exchange and commerce between the Old World and the New World, and we called this exchange the Columbian Exchange. As time went on, a huge trade zone developed between the Old World and the New World, trade that took place over the Atlantic Ocean, and in which Europeans, Africans, and Native Americans participated. And so we're going to talk about the results of this trade, especially with respect to slavery, the enslavement of millions of Africans in this expanding Atlantic world trade zone. First, we need to understand the economic policy of the time, which was very, very different from that of our own time. Now, in our day, we're used to the idea that nations should trade with each other freely, that it's beneficial to all nations to have a very free and open global trade market. And accordingly, governments in recent years have tried to remove all restrictions to trade with foreign countries, and so we have free trade agreements like NAFTA with Mexico and other countries. However, in the early modern period, and especially in the 17th and 18th century, economic policy in the European nations was totally opposite to that. Most economic thinkers believed in what was called the mercantile system, or mercantilism. What was mercantilism? Well, it was based on the idea that economies were finite and limited. In other words, that there was only so much of the pie to go around, and that the pie could never really expand. Now, contrast that to the present day view. We like to think that our economy can grow on growing and expanding forever, and that the pie will just get bigger and bigger. And everybody in our society will become more and more prosperous. But during this early modern period, people didn't really think that way. They thought that the economy was finite, the pie was only so large, and so if you traded with other countries, if you paid other countries for their goods, that your gold and your silver would flow out of your country and it would never come back. And so your pie would actually shrink and get smaller and smaller, and people would suffer and go on hard times. So the goal of mercantile policy was to prevent that from happening by stopping trade with foreign countries. But in order to do that, it became necessary for each European power to become economically self-sufficient, to produce within its own country all of the raw materials that it needed for itself, and to have all the manufacturing ability that it needed for its own citizens. And because it was impossible for European countries to do that within the narrow limits of their own borders, this was one major motivation for getting colonies in the New World, or in other places like Africa and Asia. Because if you had colonies, then the colonies could produce all the raw materials you needed, things like cotton and sugar and coffee and so forth. And they could then be shipped back to the mother country in Europe, where they would be manufactured and turned into finished goods for consumption by the citizens there. So the goal of mercantilism was really to create empires that would become completely self-sufficient, that would not need to trade with any other European country, and therefore that would be able to keep all of their gold and silver and precious metals within their own borders, and to remain prosperous for the benefit of all of their citizens. So, um, within mercantile systems, within these colonial empires, the colonies were forbidden to trade with other nations besides their own mother country. And this would become a big issue in the American English colonies leading up to the Revolution, because the colonists were great traders and they didn't like being restricted to trade within the British Empire. However, there was one major exception to the rule against trading with foreign countries, and that exception took place within Great Britain. Now, in the early 1700s, a war was fought among the great European powers. It was called the War of the Spanish Succession, and we don't need to go into detail about that. But the war was ended by a treaty in 1713 called the Treaty of Utrecht. And in this treaty, the British were awarded the exclusive right to become the slave traders for Europe. So essentially, the British took over the slave trade completely from the Spanish and Portuguese in 1713. And so, in violation of mercantile theory, Great Britain did trade with France and Spain and the other European powers to sell them slaves. Now, with the rise of trade in the Atlantic world, you see a lot of changes in European society, and the big winners were the bourgeoisie, what we would call the middle class. That is, people usually that were involved in trade or commerce or business or banking in large cities in Europe. And these people, through trade with the New World, gained a lot of wealth, a lot of power, and a lot of prestige, often at the expense of the upper classes, the titled nobility. So they became more important players in the European political world. And it's interesting, one of the places where the bourgeoisie would go to develop their expanding power within Europe was the simple coffee house. Coffee houses became all the rage in Europe during this period, and of course they are still all the rage in our society now. Why is that? Why do people want to go someplace like Starbucks and spend $4 or $5 for a skinny soy latte? Why is that so exciting to us? Well, my own personal opinion is that when we're at Starbucks, and essentially it gives us the feeling, at least, that we're part of a larger community, that we're around other human beings. Nowadays we tend to lead such isolated lives, cooped up in our offices or in our homes, that when we're someplace like Starbucks, we at least feel like we're connected, even if we're only surfing on our laptop and Facebooking and so forth. It at least gives the illusion that we are connected to a broader community. And the original coffee houses in Europe in the 17th and 18th century gave that feeling as well. But in many ways, it was a real community that was being constructed in the coffee houses. You have to understand that before coffee houses, really the only places where people could go to socialize were taverns or bars, we would call them, where they would drink alcohol together. And that continued to be very popular during this period that we're studying, but there were drawbacks, especially if you were a middle class person who was trying to rise up the ladder of success and make lots of money. If you went to the tavern too much, you might become a drunk, or you might do something embarrassing that would diminish your reputation in the business community. But if you went to the coffee house and drank coffee instead of booze, you might feel more energetic, more inspired, more motivated to go back to your office and really work hard. Um, and also, it gave you an outlet to talk to other people about the issues of the time. Coffee houses were great for promoting conversations about big political issues, excuse me, of the day. And that was even more true because coffee houses would subscribe to newspapers. And so newspapers would be passed around at coffee houses, and people would share them. That meant more people got to read them. Even if you couldn't afford a subscription to a newspaper, you could go to a coffee house and read one. Even if you couldn't read, you might be able to get someone else in the coffee house to read the newspaper to you, and so you would become better informed. And then people would talk about political issues and come up with political theories and plans. And this was very, very empowering for the middle class people in Europe who had been shut out of politics for many years, had been carried on by nobility, lords and ladies, kings and queens. But the coffee houses gave them a political space where they could develop their own potential and their own political ideas. But it's very, very ironic that, of course, coffee houses, even though they developed, they helped greater freedom, greater political freedom to develop within Europe, were built on the backs of slaves. It was slaves that were growing coffee in places like Jamaica and Brazil. And so you see that, in a sense, Africans who were sold into slavery had to pay the price by losing their liberty so that white Europeans could gain more liberty in places like coffee houses. Among the very important ideas that were discussed in coffee houses was the idea of natural law, a very key concept throughout Western European political history. What is the natural law? It was believed to be the law of God for human beings, important principles that God had put within each human person to guide their actions and their conduct so that they would lead a free and happy life. For instance, the desire to preserve one's own life was part of natural law. The desire for marriage and family, the desire for community, the desire for truth, the desire for the good. These were all considered to be part of this natural law that came from God. And many people came to believe, and we'll see more about this in the lecture on the Enlightenment, that the natural law of God should guide all human laws. Furthermore, people began to believe even more strongly that God had given, along with the natural law, certain natural rights to humanity. And usually the three natural rights were listed as life, liberty, and property. Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence would say life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So there were different ideas about natural rights, but most Europeans believed that God had given all people certain rights, the right to life, the right to liberty, the right to property, that could not be taken away from them because they were a gift of God. And so this became a very empowering belief for many Europeans, and it was one that led them at times to try to overthrow kings, as in the American and the French revolutions, as we will see later. But you may be asking yourself at this point, if Europeans believed that all human persons had a natural right to life, liberty, and property, how in the world could they justify enslaving other human beings? and you're right to ask that question. So let's explore the kinds of rationalizations that Europeans came up with to justify slavery in spite of their belief in natural rights. Well, first of all, nearly all Europeans were Christians, and they read the Bible. And if you've ever read the Bible, you know that there are slaves throughout the Bible. Slavery is mentioned and really taken for granted in the Bible, not just in the Old Testament, but even in the New Testament. For example, in the New Testament, there's a book called St. Paul's Letter to Philemon, a short letter in which St. Paul sends a slave back to his master, Philemon, telling him that the slave has become a Christian, and that henceforth the master should treat him like a Christian brother. However, it doesn't say anything about releasing the slave from slavery. He's still going to be a slave, and he's still going to have to serve his master. So, for European Christians, this was a powerful justification for slavery. It seemed as if slavery was totally compatible with Christianity according to the Bible. And not only that, but really every human society since the dawn of recorded history had slaves, and everyone knew that. Ancient Greece, ancient Rome, ancient Egypt, just run down the list, every society pretty much in history had slavery. Now, this was not racial slavery. Anybody in the ancient world or in the medieval world could become a slave. The normal or the typical way to become a slave was either becoming a captive in war or being sold into slavery to pay your debts. But anybody could be a slave. In fact, the word slave comes from the word Slav. Eastern Europeans were often sold into slavery by other Europeans into the Muslim world. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in the lecture on Asia that's also in this module. But because East Europeans so commonly became slaves, the idea of slavery was associated with these white Eastern Europeans, not with Africans. The idea that somehow Africans were uniquely suited to be enslaved was not created until the beginnings of the Age of Exploration, when the Spanish and Portuguese began to enslave Africans. And they were the ones who created the modern association of slavery with the African race. It didn't exist before that as racial slavery, but slavery had existed in all human societies since the beginning of time, and so it was a very powerful, deeply entrenched custom that, again, everyone simply took for granted. And it's very hard to overturn long-established, entrenched customs like that overnight. So, in order to rationalize the continued existence of slavery, thinkers in this early modern period argued that slavery was not a matter of natural law, the law that came from God, but it was a matter of civil law and civil rights. Now, civil law and civil rights come from society, not from God. They are rights that are granted to us, for instance, the right to vote, by our society. And the point about civil rights is that if society grants those rights, it can take them away as well. And so Europeans believed that societies had permitted slavery for a number of reasons. And the main justification they had for it was the idea that all slaves had been captured in what was called a just war. The idea was that some Africans might attack other Africans, and the victims, if they defeated their attackers and if they captured some of them, had the right um, to enslave them or to sell them into slavery. Because, after all, if you're captured in a war, in a sense, your life is at the mercy of your conqueror, right? And so, if he allows you to live, even if you become a slave, you should be grateful because he's restored your life to you. That was the theory, that all the Africans, all 12 million Africans that Europeans took over to the New World, had been captured in a just war of self-defense in Africa by other Africans, and therefore it was only right and just that they should be sold into slavery. They kept their natural right to life, but they were believed to have forfeited their rights to liberty and property. In the same way that in our society, even though people have a natural right to liberty, according to the Declaration of Independence, the government can take away your liberty, can't it? If you commit a crime, they can throw you in jail, right? And so, in this sense, the idea was that all these slaves had somehow been aggressors in a war in Africa, and so it was right for European governments to take away their liberty and to force them to become slaves. Now, in our documents, especially your document, Group 1, you're going to get a chance to explore this rationale for slavery and to comment on what you think about it. One interesting point, according to this idea of natural rights, people had a right to property. And if a slave was your property, did that mean that God had given you a right to own property in slaves? And it's interesting that during this early modern period, thinkers like Thomas Jefferson never argued that slave owners had a natural right to own property in slaves, a right that came from God. Later, in the history of slavery, especially in the 19th century in America, people would start to make that argument. But during the early modern period, nobody claimed that God had given people the right to own slaves. They simply thought that governments had permitted it for certain reasons. So you see here how even despite our deeply cherished beliefs in concepts like liberty, we're able to rationalize almost anything, aren't we, if it's in our self-interest. And that was certainly the case with slavery during the early modern period. Now, slavery then became a crucial part of mercantile systems because, after all, it was the slaves in the New World who were producing the raw materials that then would be shipped back to the mother country and create prosperity there. The most famous example of Atlantic world trading is what's known as the triangular trade in slavery. It took many forms, this triangular trade. On this map you see one version of the triangular trade. This was a voyage of a ship, an American colonial ship from Newport, Rhode Island, the Sanderson, that sailed in March 1752. And you see that it left Newport carrying a large amount of rum and some iron, which was used to buy slaves in Africa. So the rum and the iron are going to be traded for slaves in Africa. The ship made it to the Gold Coast of Africa, traded its cargo for slaves and a few other things, and then sailed for the Caribbean island of Barbados. This was England's colony, very cruel slave system. And Group 2, one of your documents is by an eyewitness to the slave system in Barbados, and you'll get to see the almost unbelievably cruel conditions that these slaves suffered under. Growing sugar cane. All right, so the Sanderson took slaves to Barbados to grow sugar cane. And while it was in Barbados, it loaded the products that those slaves had harvested in the form of molasses and sugar. And it took the molasses and sugar back to Newport, where it was turned into rum, and then the whole merry-go-round could start all over again. Molasses to rum to slaves. That was the triangular trade in its basic form. Um, and so you see how trading like this could bring prosperity to the British Empire within its own mercantile system. This map gives you some idea of where the approximately 12 million Africans who were forced to leave their homes and come to the New World to a life of slavery, where they ended up. All right, so you see that most of them came from West Africa. But look at this, this is quite striking. What region received the most slaves? Well, you see there it's the West Indies, the sugar plantations, especially on the West Indies. 42% of all those Africans ended up there. 38% of them ended up in Brazil. Then you see a smattering in other Latin American places. Only 4% of the 12 million slaves brought from Africa ended up in the British colonies in North America, the 13 original English colonies. However, as time went on, the United States developed the largest African American population in the New World, even though it had started out with such a small number of slaves. How did that happen, and what can that tell us? Think about it for a second. It must mean that those slaves in what later became the United States were reproducing faster and perhaps living longer than slaves in places like the West Indies. And that is true. Slavery in the West Indies, on the sugar plantations especially, was unbelievably brutal. The life expectancy was estimated at about 3 years. People were literally worked to death. And they didn't have time to find a mate or to have children before their death. And so the population had to be replenished in the West Indies by larger and larger shipments of slaves from Africa. Whereas in the British colonies in North America, surprisingly, slaves lived longer and they had children at quite a healthy rate. And what can that tell us about American slavery compared to slavery, say, in the West Indies or in Brazil? Well, it seems that the slaves in the future United States were treated better. They were given better food, for example, than the slaves in those other places. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying American slavery was a walk in the park. It wasn't. It was a horrible, evil institution that took its toll on the lives of millions of people over hundreds of years. Absolutely miserable institution, but compared to slavery in the West Indies, American slavery was preferable in the sense, or at least you could say the treatment was less cruel, and the slaves had a better chance of living to maturity and to reproducing. So, an interesting thought as we go forward.